Howdy, Ags. It's about that time again. It's time for more biomechanics. Hope you guys are ready. Hope you're feeling well. Hope the family is well. You're hanging in there. Semester's getting closer to the end. We only have a few weeks. And that's the good news. So today, our focus is going to be to complete the section on skeletal muscle biomechanics. Our focus today is on mostly active tension, the effect of shortening and lengthening velocity, eccentric versus concentric contractions, some trade-offs there, the effect of temperature on muscle force, muscle power, etc., especially in vivo. Fiber types, how does that affect things, including power? We'll talk a little bit about reflexes, and then we'll go into the effects of aging, skeletal muscle injuries, particularly delayed onset muscle soreness, to kind of finish out things today. We'll probably talk a little bit about reflexes, maybe some information regarding two joint muscles before we move on into talking about bone mechanics. Okay, so let's get started. Last time we talked about excitation, contraction, coupling, the effects of muscle size, meaning muscle cross-sectional area, stretching a muscle, muscle length, how that affects both active tension and passive tension, rate coding, which means increasing the frequency of action potentials coming down those alpha motor neurons, and along with motor unit recruitment, that's the way we control the amount of force that a muscle is producing. So today we're going to start off by talking about the effects of movement, which means velocity of the muscle. How fast is that muscle shortening? So we're going to take a look at both isometric and isotonic contractions. And contractions are kind of a strange word because we really mean that the muscle is being activated. There are electrical potentials going down through action potentials going down to the muscles. The muscles are starting to contract. If there's no movement, meaning the net torque is equal to 0, then we have an isometric contraction. So that means the sum of the forces, oh, that looks like a strange S. Let me fix that. There we go. As we go, the sum of the torques and the sum of the forces in any given direction, boom, magic, are equal to 0. If we have an isotonic contraction, that means the muscle's changing its length. In two ways we can do that: shortening versus lengthening. Both of these are incredibly important because we need lengthening contractions in order to let an object down, in order to slow down movement, in order to catch a football or a basketball or a baseball or a softball. So we can have concentric contractions, which are shortening contractions. Kind of sounds like jumbo shrimp to me. That simply means that the muscle is being activated, but it's shortening. And then eccentric or lengthening contractions. So the concentric contraction, it simply means that the agonist muscles have produced enough torque to overcome all of the resistances. So in terms of torque, it's getting late. We're getting a little late start today. So the sun, unfortunately, is setting. We've had some prep and some other things to do. Concentric contractions are shortening contractions, and we're overcoming weight or inertia or outside contact forces. Let's say that we hit a tennis ball or a baseball. Eccentric contractions have a lot of different uses as well. So, okay, Trixie, easy. Easy. Shh. Okay, little interruption there from our canine friend. She's going to remind us later about the importance of muscle temperature and optimal muscle temperature in people as well as animals. With eccentric contractions, we can brake against a powerful movement, brake against gravity. So if we're doing an elbow flexion exercise, as we let that weight down, we're producing an eccentric contraction, which means it's lengthening. The maximal potential or force that can be produced with an eccentric contraction is actually greater than a concentric or an isometric contraction. You could be catching a softball, moving towards precisely towards a target, in which case we have what we call an agonist-antagonist burst. So let's say I'm trying to catch a pen or a pencil that's moving in the air. So my hand will go out because of concentric contractions of the triceps brachii. These are the elbow extensors, of course. And as my hand gets to the target, I don't want to miss the target. I want to make sure I hit the target. So then I have an eccentric contraction of the antagonist muscles, which in this case are the biceps brachii, the brachialis, and the brachioradialis. So if we catch an object like that, notice my elbow extends, but then it stops. So can't do it in slow motion, but that's what we're trying to do, is hone in on that target. You probably notice as it went down, it kind of bounced back a little bit because of that agonist and then antagonist burst. So catching a softball is a really good example. See a little photo there. So this is a force-velocity relationship. So notice that the velocity in the middle is equal to 0. So this is where we have no movement at all. That means an isometric contraction. Notice we have force on the y-axis. And these are maximal efforts. So with a maximal effort, you can actually produce more force with an eccentric contraction. So a couple reasons for that. When a muscle is being stretched, it sort of pulls on the myosin heads, which have potential energy. It's also going to pull on titin, which remember is that spring protein. So both of those are going to actually increase the amount of force that we see with an eccentric contraction. Then when we start to look at concentric contractions, there's actually a trade-off again. So the idea is that when a muscle is shortening, you have faster cross-bridge cycling. The faster the cross-bridge cycling, the greater the probability at any moment that the myosin heads are not in contact with the actin. So with an isometric contraction, you're in contact and you're pulling. So you can produce a lot of force. So for example, a maximal bench press is pretty close to your maximal isometric contraction. If you're hitting something like hitting a badminton shuttlecock, or if you're playing ping pong, for example, you're probably on this end of the curve where you can produce a lot of shortening, a lot of movement, but notice the force is really low. So this is the trade-off. The faster you're moving, the less force you can produce, and that means you can overcome a smaller resistance. So we only get rapid movement against fairly small forces or small resistances. So we have, again, that trade-off with concentric contractions. So you probably notice in biomechanics, a lot of times we have a trade-off. Sometimes we can have our cake and eat it too, but again, many times we'll have a trade-off. It's not all bad though, so let's think about some advantages of an eccentric contraction, especially a maximal effort. So one of the things to notice about this relationship between torque and joint angle is that the amount of torque changes throughout the range of motion. And that's because the angle of pull, remember, of that muscle is changing throughout the range of motion. It's closest to 90 degrees somewhere in the middle, and then closer to 0 on the other end. So again, closer to 90 here, closer to 0. When I say closer, it won't be like 2 or 3 degrees, but the idea is that the angle of pull gets smaller, and as it gets smaller and we resolve that vector, a lot of that force is going to go towards producing stabilization at the joint, especially when there's a co-contraction. So eccentric contractions are a protective mechanism for joints and bones. Muscles' ability to be able to produce torque also changes throughout the range of motion. So as we're looking at these curves, notice that the eccentric contraction curve is higher than the isometric as far as torque's concerned, and it's in the right units. I'm always happy about that. And here's the concentric contractions. So the maximal effort, you can always produce more force with an eccentric versus an isometric versus a concentric. Now, having said that, when you're lifting a weight and then letting it down, during the eccentric phase, you're producing less force and therefore less torque. But your ability to produce force and torque is much higher with an eccentric contraction. So let's think about what would that be good for? Well, let's say that you're lifting like a really heavy object. Let's see what I've got here. There we go. Pretend this is a barbell. So I'm lifting this trying to lift this really heavy object, and I can't get it above my head. So if I can't complete a concentric contraction, I can hold it steady until someone helps me, or I can let it down really slowly. So this is another protective mechanism for joints and for bones. And this is just a reminder with your big projects, your research projects, you're going to be doing both anatomical analysis of movement and the mechanical analysis of movement. So remember, with anatomical analysis, identify the joints that are moving, what type of movement is it, identify the muscles that are involved in the movement. So if I'm doing this, it'll be the supraspinatus and the middle deltoid. Deduce whether these muscles are producing isometric, concentric, eccentric contractions. It's an old type of biomechanical analysis, and really the science got better once we were able to do EMG activity on these muscles. So I'm going to just skip over that. Just a review on mechanical work and power, etc. Work is the force applied on an object multiplied by how far we move the object. So if you're doing like a military press, the height that you lift it times the weight, that's going to be the work done. If you climb a set of stairs, or if you're on a cycle ergometer, or if you're pushing a sled, you can measure the force and the distance moved. The units are force times distance, newtons times meters. It looks like torque, doesn't it? So what we usually do is use our shorthand, the joules. So 1 joule is equal to 1 Newton meter. In the English system, we don't bother with that. It's just foot-pounds. The same units as torque. Having said that, again, the distance is not the distance between the axis of rotation and where the force is being applied, like torque. It's actually how far we move the object. So, as I said, lifting a free weight, riding a cycle ergometer, pushing a sled, etc., those are all good ways to measure work. So here's someone doing a military press, and we're thinking about some of the muscles that would be involved in the work. I stole this from a biomechanics text. Having said that, this would be more important with a lat pull down. So I think I'll have to replace that this evening. Mechanical work is, let's say we're doing a little problem, and we're lifting a 300 Newton weight, a height of 0.6 meters. This reminds me of actually the first semester I taught biomechanics. So I go into all these biomechanics books, get these cool pictures, and I start to lecture and realize I look at the picture like, oh, that's wrong. That's actually not helpful. And so I've tried to use them over the years as teaching tools, but I'm just amused that I got caught again here. Okay, so work is equal to force times distance, 300 newtons times 0.6 meters, and that's 180 Newton meters or 180 joules of work. So work rate, that means the work done per unit time. Another word for that, of course, is power. We're going to skip over negative and positive work. It just means eccentric and concentric contractions. Not that exciting to me. Let's go back and take a look at power. And then I'm going to come back. So power is the amount of work performed in a given amount of time. So we get P. Remember, we've got work divided by distance times time. Gonna improve that. There we go. Oops. Distance times. I'm editing as I go. Hold on a second. Let's see, power is equal to work divided by time. So that doesn't look quite right, does it? So I was editing before. Yeah, that looks a lot better. Okay, so if work is force times distance, there we go. That's a lot better. Sorry to edit as we go. Work divided by time or work rate. So it's force times distance divided by delta T, and that's equal to force times distance. So this is really a product or combination of strength and speed. That's what power is about. It's both. You got to be fast, but you got to be able to produce a lot of force. So that means it's related to sports or events like the shot put, jumping, anything involved jumping, really, whether it's basketball or whether it's volleyball, whether it's doing the high jump or long jump, those are all incredibly important. So work rate. The units are watts, and that's 1 joule of work performed per second. In the English system, it's horsepower. There we go. So I'm going to do a little power and work calculation. I have a person who weighs 580 newtons, and they run up a flight of 30 stairs, each with a height of 25 centimeters. The time it takes for this effort is 15 seconds. So find the work and the power. So we got 580 newtons. We've climbed a set of 30 stairs. Each one's 25 centimeters high. That gives me 7.5 meters. The time is 15 seconds. That's 4350 joules and 290 watts. If we complete that, let's say we run up really fast, and I'm going to make it 5 seconds instead of 15 seconds. That would be what, 580 and 290. So that would be 870 watts of power. That's a lot of power. You can always produce more power over a short period of time than your VO2 max. This might be the type of power we maintain for a VO2 max, which is the kind of intensity you see in the 1 to 2 mile race, for example. So with these force velocity relationships, we're going to keep in mind the combination of force times velocity. Now I'm going to back up the truck a little bit and just remind ourselves about different types of energy and energy production, and relate that to, again, efficiency of locomotion. So this will be a little bit of a review. Energy is the ability, of course, to produce work. It's manifested in a number of different forms. So there's kinetic energy, which is the integral, of course, of momentum, and it's 1/2 times mass times velocity squared. So this is one of the reasons why speed is so important in terms of kinetic energy, because that kinetic energy is proportional to the square of the velocity. Mass is important, but that's why a bullet, which doesn't have very much mass, unfortunately, can produce a lot of kinetic energy. If they hit you, it's bad news. And especially like a small object in spaceflight that might be going 1,000 or even 18,000 miles an hour, they can cause tremendous amounts of damage. So today, even in low Earth orbit, we really get concerned not just with small, asteroids coming in. They could even be like pea-size or golf ball size. They would be deadly if they hit a spacecraft. But we're also concerned about space junk, which could be moving, compared with the spacecraft, hundreds of miles an hour difference, even more. That could produce tremendous amounts of kinetic energy. We have a number of different types of potential energy. There's the potential energy of position or related to gravity. So that's mass times acceleration to gravity times height. So when you drop an object, that potential energy turns into kinetic energy. Strain energy is spring energy, remember? So it's the product of the spring constant, which is the stiffness, times how far we've stretched the object. And for energy, it's 1/2 times K times delta X squared, where delta X is the amount of stretching or bending we produce. With gross efficiency, with a lot of exercises, if you're climbing a set of stairs, or unless you're a well-trained cyclist, for most of us, riding a bicycle, we're about 20% efficient. That means about 80% of the energy we use probably is going to go towards heat. So this time of year and later, that can be a problem if you're outdoors. So mechanical efficiency for running and walking, though, is significantly greater. This is partly due to the arch of the foot. We have the plantar fascia, the calcaneonavicular ligament. We're going to reemphasize the Achilles tendon, muscles in the lower extremities. Those are all incredibly important. So for a typical person running at about 4.5 meters per second, the arch of the foot can store about 17 joules of energy. It takes about 110 joules of energy for every step. The Achilles tendon and the plantar flexors can store about 35 joules of energy. Other muscles like the quadriceps can store at least 50 joules of energy. This means we can store over 50% of the energy that we need to expend for each step of running in these natural springs. However, we can't return a lot of this potential energy into kinetic energy, but enough to increase the efficiency. So if we can reduce the energy used or expended, the energy used for a given amount of mechanical work, which means our running speed and how far we're moving our body for running a mile or two, that will increase the efficiency and allow us to have better endurance. So that's important. So why? Well, again, to reemphasize two major mechanisms, these natural springs that we just talked about, that store spring or potential energy and turn some of it into kinetic energy once we start to move. And then the legs can also act like a pendulum. So as a reminder, the frequency is 1 divided by 2 pi. That's a constant, not exciting. And then you would multiply by the acceleration due to gravity, also a constant, and then divide by the distance between the axis of rotation of the pendulum and the center of mass. So the length is something we can alter for our legs. We can flex our hips and knees and actually shorten the pendulum and turn it from a grandfather clock to a cuckoo clock. So it's probably, in terms of the pendulum motion, that's probably a little bit more important in walking, and spring actions a little bit more important with running. But anything that changes a person's gait can affect the amount of force and energy that can be stored in those springs, and also affect pendulum motion, therefore reducing the efficiency by increasing the energy that you have to expend. So as people get older, your VO2 max and your aerobic ceiling decreases, but the amount of energy it takes to do the same amount of work increases. So you really get caught in the middle in terms of getting tired in endurance. So aging, stroke, orthopedic injuries, neuromuscular disease can greatly decrease mechanical efficiency. Okay, so we looked at this power calculation. So again, let's revisit our force-velocity relationship. With eccentric contractions, maximally, we can produce a lot of force. And then with concentric contractions, we have this trade-off between force production and velocity. So let me show you what we mean. If you're doing something like a maximal bench press, by the way, that's called a power lift. It's not a power lift because you're producing this huge force, but the velocity of concentric contraction or motion is actually very low. If you take a big number, let's say like the force, and you multiply by a very small number, I'm taking this opportunity to change the font. I'm not a fan of Times New Roman. Let's see, let's make it a color. Just turn it into blue, that's cool. Let's increase the font size. There we go. Okay. So if we want to produce a lot of power, you need to be somewhere in the middle, right around here, because there we're going to have a significant amount of force and velocity. For a maximal bench press, we can have this huge force, but we're multiplying by a really slow velocity because all you have to do is just complete the lift. It doesn't have to be fast. There we go. On the other end of the spectrum, someone may be hitting a badminton shuttlecock. They just have to be quick. So they're flicking their wrist, a lot of velocity. Doesn't take a lot of force to be able to do this. You're not going to see bulked up people playing badminton. So that means power again is going to be low. So in either end of this force velocity curve, when we look at the power and calculate it, it's going to be low. It's going to be higher in the middle. So let's take a look at that. There we go. So someone like a linebacker or a shot putter, these are people who produce the huge amounts of power. So peak power, notice, is somewhere in the middle at about 1/3 of maximal velocity and about 1/3 to 1/2 of peak force as well. So if I overlap our force velocity curve and our power velocity curve, it's going to look like that. So this is where we produce the greatest amount of power. That combination of strength and speed. So if you're trying to train someone to increase power, you have to look at some things that will increase movement velocity and increase force. Obviously, resistive training can increase force, so that increases power. And that's why anabolic steroids are forbidden for sprinters. Ben Johnson in 1988 won the gold medal, but had it taken away from him because he used Dianabol. And let's see, that's off a little bit. There we go. But we can do some things to increase movement speed. Training can't make the muscles contract really much faster, mostly because we can't convert slow twitch fibers into fast twitch fibers. But what we can do, we can work through better technique for a sprinter, increasing the amount of hip flexion and knee flexion just before the jump. We also see this for someone getting ready to shoot a jump shot. We don't want to use the term bend down. They'll have hip flexion, knee flexion, dorsiflexion of the ankle. That allows them to be able to produce more torque, more force between their foot and the ground, and get that shot up. Spiking a volleyball, it's the same type of thing. So working on technique, things like plyometrics, that can increase the effectiveness of recruitment of motor units so that you time it a lot better. That can increase potentially the speed of the movement and even the force, both of which, of course, will increase the power. A type of weightlifting that does produce a lot of power, it's not the bench press, it's an Olympic lift. Let's see if I've got a picture of that. Where did it go? Oh, gosh, I thought I had it. High jumper is a better example of someone who produces a lot of power. Basketball player, shot putter. For speed, we might be talking about badminton, frisbee, a shortstop. They're quick. Anybody that's quick, they might be able to produce a lot of speed, but they can't generate a lot of force, so they can't produce a lot of power. So again, here's a shot putter. That is Randy Barnes, and I think that might be the winning throw in the Atlanta 1996 Olympic Games. Here's a running back. They can also produce a lot of power. And is this going to work? No. A dunk in basketball can also is a nice way of increasing the amount of power. I think when I was editing, I may have accidentally erased. That's embarrassing. Accidentally erased okay, slide or two. So we'll go back. So building the power athlete, we're going to be focusing more on that in just a second. We've gone over potential energy. So remember, when we start to either warm up or we get out in the day like today or anytime pretty much later until maybe October, it's going to be warm out there. And as we exercise, our muscle temperature and body temperature are going to increase. And that's because gross efficiency of locomotion or exercise is nowhere close to 100% efficient. It's usually, again, about 20% efficient. With walking and running, we can get up to maybe 27, 28% efficient. That's about as high as it gets. So you're really looking at 75 to 80% of the energy ends up going towards heat. So can we do something with it? Yeah, there's some good news about that. Some heat is actually pretty important. When most people exercise, they kind of burn a fever in a sense, because when you're exercising, your body temperature, at least your core temperature, is not 98.6. It's actually considerably higher. It's about 101 to 102 degrees, especially if you're exercising vigorously. When you're relaxed, the muscles in your forearms, for example, and your legs are actually not at body core temperature. They're a few degrees lower. So increasing blood flow at the beginning of exercise and the increased heat and temperature that occurs with exercise actually has some positive benefits. So let's look at the effect of temperature and a warm-up, for example, on muscle and joint function. It can decrease the joint synovial fluid viscosity. That actually makes the joint a little easier to move. So the faster people are moving, believe it or not, the better synovial fluid works, especially as the temperature increases. So the friction at your joints is actually a little bit less. For muscles, there's something called a Q10 effect. You may ask, what is that? That means for every 10 degrees Celsius, metabolism doubles. So you probably know with cold-blooded animals, poikilotherms, that on a cold day, they like to get out into the sun, like a snake or a lizard might crawl out from a rock and get into the sun to heat its body up and increase its metabolism. If it's too hot, they're going to climb under the rock or into the ground to try to cool themselves off. So they're dependent on the environment to regulate their body temperature. So they're going to need behavior to do that. So what does that mean? Well, forearm muscles, especially on a cool day, could be like 94 degrees. And if they go up to like 101 degrees, like you would see during exercise, so that's 7 degrees, that's about 4 degrees Celsius. That's pretty significant in terms of an increase in metabolism. So that would make a big difference in terms of everything from an endurance runner to maybe someone playing tennis. You want to get your metabolism up. Increases, of course, blood flow. Mechanical efficiency increases as the temperature of tendons, ligaments, muscles increases and cartilage increases. It becomes easier to move. There's less friction. There's less internal force that has to be produced. And that means that you're more efficient. It takes less energy to complete that movement. Muscle viscosity and internal work in the muscle decreases. So both of those increase the mechanical efficiency. There's a big increase in maximal velocity with increased temperature. It increases the power. In vivo, it doesn't change maximal isometric tension. In an isolated muscle in vitro, in a saline bath, it does, but it doesn't seem to in vivo. And we think there's actually some reflexes possibly involved in that. It gets a little complicated. So this is something I drew a long time ago. I've got to recapitulate this on a computer diagram. But what you can see, the solid lines are the force velocity curve, that's the blue line, and the power velocity curve, that's the hump looking thing. So remember a trade-off with a force velocity curve between force and velocity. Where force production can be high, velocity is low. Where velocity is high, force is low. When you're in the middle, that's where you can produce the greatest amount of peak power. So if we look at these curves and add in an increased temperature, what we see is that especially at faster movement speeds, you're going to be able to produce more force. You're going to be able to increase the speed of the muscle contraction. So that does make a big difference. With power, especially in the middle and near the end, you have a significant increase in power. So golfers are kind of in this part of the curve. They definitely like warm days. That's why they like to live in California, play golf in Hawaii or Florida, places like that. They like it warm. The Masters is, of course, every April, except this April, unfortunately, in Augusta, where it's starting to get warm, starting to get about 80 degrees, and they usually don't play the U.S. Open until it's June and it's warm up in Pennsylvania or Illinois or New York or wherever they have to play, it. Um, so again, at faster movement speeds, power is definitely up in the middle at those higher levels. So that'll make a difference to a lot of different types of athletes. Okay, you may recognize this creature because, well, she's right beside me right now snoring. So if you notice a dog coming in from time to time, that's Trixie. So this is a picture of Trixie. There's a Kong over there. The reason I bring out Trixie, like most canines, operates at optimal muscle temperature all the time. Dogs can go from sleeping to running out the door in a second or two. It takes them almost no time. So that way, if they have to be charged into action, their muscles are at optimal temperature. They don't need to warm up. They've got it built in. It does mean at higher temperatures, when it's warm, that they have a hard time getting rid of the heat. But in terms of being an aerobic animal at moderate temperatures, they can really do it because their bodies are at about 101 all the time. So when we're exercising, our body temperature and core temperature can increase to 38.5 to 39 degrees, 101 to 101.5. So one of the benefits of exercise is actually this increase in temperature. It increases heat shock proteins and other types of protective proteins. It gets to be really super important. Again, at higher body temperatures, we have to worry about getting rid of heat. Humans are pretty good at that because we can sweat. We get an increase in skin blood flow. We have these fine hairs, which actually helps with heat dissipation. We're kind of built for heat dissipation. It doesn't feel like it in July sometimes here in College Station, but we are kind of built to be able to do that. Under cold conditions, we wear a lot of clothes. So precautions needed, limiting work, appropriate clothing, fluid replacement that we talked about. Okay, an overview of muscle fiber types. So I know you've covered this in exercise physiology, so I don't want to spend too long, but what I want to talk about is how it affects muscle mechanics. Those are the force velocity curves and the power velocity curves that we've just talked about. So we have two muscle types in general, slow twitch fibers and fast twitch fibers. And as the name suggests, if we have a single action potential, we can follow the twitch. And for a slow twitch fiber, it takes a long time to reach a peak and comes down to baseline a little later, maybe a little slower. Fast twitch fibers reach their peak much faster. They can dump out calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum really fast. The calcium ATPase pump is also fast. That's one of the ways we stain for fiber types. Usually we stain the ATPase, which of course uses ATP for energy. The other method usually involves myosin head fiber types. So you have slow twitch myosin, you have fast twitch myosin, and then the fast twitch fibers, we can break it down to type 2A, 2Bs, and 2Ds, or 2Xs, they mean the same thing. The type 2Bs and type 2Ds or 2Xs, mechanically, they do about the same thing. They're larger fibers, they can produce a lot of force, they can also shorten really quickly, and so they can produce a lot of power. They're our booster rocket, and we recruit them at higher intensities, So we're going to focus on type 1, which are slow twitch muscle fibers, type 2A, which are kind of intermediate fibers, are usually pink in color in humans. They are pretty trainable with endurance training. Type 2Bs or 2Ds, both of these are fast twitch glycolytic. They're truly white. So red muscles, slow twitch fibers are red because of myoglobin. Remember, myoglobin is really a quarter, in a sense, of a hemoglobin molecule. You take one of those tetramers out, and basically it is myoglobin. So that's what makes muscles red. The mitochondria help a little bit. They're actually brown in color. So muscles look kind of brownish red if you think about it. If they're infused with blood and it's oxygenated, then the muscle is going to look generally pretty red if it's a slow twitch fiber, pink to red. The 2A, the pink fibers, are really trainable in both directions. We see even some switching from 2As to 2Bs during sprinting and sometimes some weight training. We can see a little bit of a shift from 2As to type 1s with endurance training. What we don't see, even with sprint training or resistor training, is a switch from type 1 to type 2A or B. And it means to have a high percentage of fast twitch fibers, the only way to get it is to pick your parents wisely. So choose parents that have a high percentage of fast twitch fibers. Most people are 50-50, 50% fast twitch, 50% slow twitch. So this is a typical old school histochemical stain. It takes advantage of the fact that ATPases, different ATPases from slow twitch or fast twitch fibers are more labile, or more susceptible to inactivation, either at a high pH or a low pH. And we take advantage of that to make these stains. This was probably stained at a pH of about 4.2, and we see the slow twitch fibers are the dark in color, where you have a high ATPase that's active. The type 2As are actually white. It's a little counterintuitive. You would have thought they'd be in the middle. But in terms of the stain, they're actually white. The type 2Bs are pink here. They're in the middle. These don't reflect the true colors of the muscle. It's just the way the stain comes out. But the point is that we can separate these fibers. This is nice because you can see really thin connective tissue or endomysium surrounding each fiber. These are classic cross sections. And then you can actually see a fasciculus here. All of that right there is a fasciculus. Here's some probably connective tissue and some fat. It looks like right here in the middle. So there's another fasciculus right here, or a group of fibers, so you can see the paramecium. So pretty nice set of stains. Slow twitch fibers, the name suggests they're slow. You're not going to see a lot of sprinters with a high percentage of type 1 fibers. You might see some endurance runners. They're red because of the myoglobin. They have a lot of mitochondria. They tend to burn more fat in terms of fuel versus carbohydrate. It doesn't mean that if you have a high percentage of slow twitch fibers that you're going to stay thin, or if you have a high percentage of fast twitch fibers, you're not. In the end, it's just how many calories you burn when you're exercising and during the course of the day. Type 2A fibers, they're fast twitch, they're pink, they have a moderate number of mitochondria. You can increase that actually fairly significantly with endurance training. So the type 2A fibers become more red in color. They become a bit more fatigue resistant, not as much as the type 1 fibers or slow twitch fibers. The type 2Bs are fast. They're the white meat, if you will, the white muscle. They don't have a lot of mitochondria. They don't have much myoglobin, and they fatigue really faster. They're the booster rockets. The muscle fibers are large with the type 2B fibers, smallest with the type 1. There's some exceptions. It doesn't always follow the rule, but in general, that's the way it is. The cross-sectional area of the alpha motor neuron is largest with the type 2Bs and then smallest with the type 1s. So what does that mean? At the spinal cord, we start recruiting the alpha motor neurons that are the smallest in cross-sectional area first, and then the largest ones are recruited last. That's the size principle for motor neurons. Blood supply, not surprisingly, is high for the type 1s. With endurance training, 2As can have a fairly high blood supply. There's more extracellular matrix or connective tissue with the type 1 muscles or type 1 fibers. because they're active more often. And with that mechanical stress that's going on all the time, you get more connective tissue. Efficiency wise, the type 1 fibers are a little bit more efficient than the type 2As and 2B fibers. So this is the size principle for motor neurons. Each one of these circles represents a cross-sectional area of the muscle fiber. So for type 1 muscles, you recruit them all the time. Rest, standing, high intensity. It does mean during weightlifting, you can get a response from the type 1 fibers, but since you're using them all the time, it's not quite as great as the fast twitch fibers. But having said that, there's actually no fiber type difference when we look at weightlifters that might be doing something like bench press or deadlift, the quote unquote power lifts, which are not power lifts. Maybe they didn't pass biomechanics. I don't know. Type 2A fibers, you start recruiting those when you're going from walking to jogging, about 40% of your VO2 max. So when you're running and jogging and playing soccer, whatever you happen to be doing that you like, chances are you probably start to recruit these type 2A fibers. The type 2Bs of booster rockets, we start recruiting these, not coincidentally, right at the lactate threshold, because they're going to use a lot of glycolysis. They're going to crank out a lot of pyruvate and lactate. And when that happens, you start to see it in the blood and it builds up in muscles, etc. Can contribute to fatigue. But remember, lactate can be used as fuel by muscles, heart, the brain, etc. So you start recruiting these 2B fibers at about 70-75% VO2 max and higher. They would have the largest alpha motor neurons in cross-sectional area, but the fastest conductance. So the larger the cable, the faster the conductance. So we're talking about 100 meters per second. Once we make a decision, and most people's arms are not much over a meter, so doesn't take very long, 1/100th of a second or less, to get from the spinal cord and brain to those muscles in the arms and legs. Most people are about 50% fast twitch and 50% slow twitch. So what can we do in terms of training? Well, as I mentioned, sprinters, man, they can be like 75% fast twitch fibers, but so can shot putters. Shot putters and sprinters have virtually the same percentage of fast twitch fibers. I think shot putters are actually slightly higher, believe it or not. There's no training regimen that can increase the percentage of fast twitch fibers. There are a number of techniques, better biomechanics, doing some exercises like plyometrics that potentially can increase movement speed, but you can't make the muscles contract really much faster. The percentage of fast twitch fibers does increase with a few pathologies and other situations: spinal cord injuries, hyperthyroidism, muscular dystrophy, heart failure, space flight. Obviously, none of these are ergogenic aids. They're not a way to get someone to sprint faster. In all of these circumstances, you get a lot of muscle atrophy as well. So you'd suspect that. And so the muscles can't produce a lot of force. Even though they're slightly faster, they can't produce a lot of power. So it's not something you can really use. But as we learn how this happens, it may happen someday that we have gene therapy or something else to increase a person's movement speed. So that's going to be really interesting in terms of Olympics and competition, because someday people are going to be able to manipulate this one way or the other. With endurance training, we can see a small shift from type 2B or 2D fibers. Those are both white or fast twitch glycolytic fibers. Mechanically, they work pretty much the same. So in biomechanics, we don't distinguish really between them. You probably will, or maybe talk about that in exercise physiology, especially in the graduate level. So you do get some movement from type 2Bs to 2As. And then you get some movement of type 2As to type 1s. So the type 2A fibers can kind of shift in both directions, but you can't really get slow twitch fibers to become fast twitch fibers. And the number of 2Bs and 2Ds or percentage-wise, there's not surprisingly the lowest percentage with endurance runners. So with endurance runners, we see a lot of type 2As and type 1s. So the muscles are very pink and red. You can see the difference, lots of myoglobin. Myoglobin binds to oxygen and it makes it easier for oxygen to get into the mitochondria so that we never really run out of oxygen and fuel. Um, this is something really interesting. This was taken from athletes in Scandinavia. So that would be like Norway, Sweden, probably Denmark. So as they were looking at these athletes and their percentage of slow and fast twitch fibers, it gives us a clue who are the really power athletes and really who aren't and who are the good endurance runners. So let's look at non-athletes. Typical persons, 47 to 53%, 50-50 for most of us. Weightlifters, and this would be bench press, this wouldn't be Olympic lifters. They produce a lot of power. People who do the clean and jerk and the snatch can have very high power outputs. But the so-called power lifts, the bench press and the deadlift, it's about 50-50. So it's not an advantage of being able to move really fast. However, track sprinters, 55 to 75% fast twitch fibers. Look at the shot putters, 60 to 75% fast twitch fibers. And look at the endurance runners on the other end of the spectrum, 60 to 90. We could get a small movement of type 1 fibers to type 2As, but it's only about 10%. So you can see at either end of the spectrum, you can't really turn a true power athlete into an endurance athlete and vice versa. So that's what makes them kind of freakish athletes. It means, and they have to train like crazy, but the potential is there for the most part. It's inherent. There are some other mechanical factors that can make a really good sprinter really, really fast, and that has to do with their mechanics and turnover and their makeup. Again, one of the things you can do to increase power is to increase the amount of force you can generate. Sometimes we see a higher force production with muscles that have a higher percentage of fast twitch fibers. And for sure, we see it with power, especially at the faster movement speeds. So this product of force times velocity, when you have muscles that have a high percentage of fast twitch fibers, they can definitely produce more power. So that would be an advantage for the clean and jerk. It would be an advantage for, again, a true power lift like the snatch, or a shot putter, or a discus thrower, or a basketball player, especially one that dunks a lot. So we're going to take a look at that in just a second. So building the power athlete is, again, going back to this power equation. That's how we can figure this out. So force times distance divided by time. Distance divided by time is velocity. So anything we can do to increase force, increase movement speed is going to help. So I'm going to move. Got my YouTube video here. So let's move things around, see if I can get this to work. You'll look at some power athletes from last basketball season. Unfortunately, this basketball season is not going to finish, even though A&M had really, for the men, they had a really good year. Sorry, I've got to stretch this out and then move it over. Oh, that's not it. There we go. Almost. We try to come on. There we go. Goodness gracious. Okay, let's look at some power athletes specifically. We're looking at who could have been Rookie of the Year. Zion Williamson, we're looking at last year. They should have gone to the Final Four, should have won it all, but it didn't happen. I won't really discuss why. It's when you have two great players and one of them has to be the boss. One of them has to be the king. And that should have been Zion Williamson, but they sometimes didn't get him the ball late in key games, especially that last game that they played against I think it was Michigan State.
He talked to us about live ball turnovers, especially.
Here we go. Oh, that's what we're talking about. Get that power going. So a lot of force, a lot of velocity. There we go. Get a steal. There he is. Go, go. Oh, my goodness. Okay. That was hard to set up, but it was worth it. It was worth it. So let's, boom. Building that power athlete. We're getting back here. Let's see. There we go. These are the true power athletes. That's Randy Barnes, who set 30 years ago this month, set the shot put record. So you'll be happy to know an Aggie has the men's shot put record 30 years for this event. And here we see a young woman doing probably looks like the snatch to me instead of the clean and jerk. That's a true power event. So we can see peak powers for Olympic lifts that exceed 2,500, 3,000 watts. That's actually 10 times this person's VO2 max. That's pretty cool. So you can generate these huge amounts of power. You just can't do it for very long. Humans are pretty good at that. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about reflexes over the next few minutes, detecting position and movement. We have a number of receptors, proprioceptors, which detect muscle and joint movement, and exteroceptors that tell us about the environment. Some of them are in the skin. For proprioceptors, we're going to talk briefly about muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, which provide a safety reflex, joint receptors. They give us a kinesthesis or awareness of movement. So muscle spindles, joint receptors, Golgi tendon organs, and even receptors in the palm of our hands and feet are giving us information all the time about force and torque and movement. We know how fast we're moving. I can close my eyes and kind of guess at how fast I'm moving my elbow. I can, let's say, get an elbow flexion angle. Let's see if I got to move it over here. That's about 90. It's about 45. That's about 135. So I don't have to see what's going on to actually know where my joint position is. And if I want to catch or move an object, I don't really have to look at it that much. I've got this kinesthesis or awareness of where the ball is going, and I'm actually getting some feedback by looking at myself. So it's not actually that hard. So we can take advantage of these. We can also produce some reflexes that'll be really important. The muscle spindle helps to produce a stretch reflex. There's something called reciprocal inhibition that relaxes the antagonist muscles. Golgi tendon organs produce a safety reflex that's going to help to reduce the amount of force that a muscle is producing to protect joints and bones. Joint receptors give us an idea. Pacinian corpuscles tell us about movement, and Ruffini endings tell us about position. So, going through this pretty quickly, the Golgi tendon organs. Well, this is almost in the right place. I have fun with biomechanics and the textbooks sometimes. That's why I'm working on one. The Golgi tendon organ actually is near the myotendinous junction. Why? Because there's a lot of stress right there, a lot of force divided by cross-sectional area. You have two materials coming together that have different properties, try to work with each other. It's basically like a steel bolt and a plastic nut. It's hard to get them to work quite right. So it's there to be able to detect when mechanical stress is really high on a muscle, when either the muscle could be torn, and those tears occur near the myotendinous junction, or it could injure a joint. Then that large load causes strain on the Golgi tendon organ sensors. You send afferent information in the form of action potentials down to the spinal cord. Here we have an interneuron. So we stimulate this interneuron, and this interneuron, what it's going to do is inhibit action potentials produced by the alpha motor neurons. Specifically, they produce what are called postsynaptic potentials. In fact, we call them inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, meaning they reduce the likelihood that this alpha motor neuron will fire. It reduces the frequency of action potentials. It also reduces the number of motor units that are actually recruited. So those are a couple of mechanisms to reduce the force. So if the force gets too high, the Golgi tendon organ will kick in and actually reduce the amount of force that that muscle is producing. Muscle spindles are interfusal fibers. They're in between the muscle fibers. There are usually a few of them, like 3 or 4 of them, in between certain muscle fibers. So when the muscle is being stretched, the muscle spindle is being stretched, it helps to detect length of the muscle, but especially what it's good at is detecting the speed of the stretch. The faster the stretch, the greater the response of the muscle spindles. So it's going to send action potentials down afferent neurons to the spinal cord, which in turn is going to produce a stretch reflex, which is going to increase the contractility of the agonist muscle, and then reciprocal inhibition, which is going to reduce the amount of force that the antagonist muscle is producing. So we have 2 types of responses: phasic, that responds to really just, tonic, that responds to length, and then phasic, that responds to the speed of the stretch. So it's really the phasic that's probably most important. The tonic response can get reset by the gamma motor neuron system. So let's say I'm moving slowly and I stop. That's probably going to reset those muscle spindles as the movement stops. We can take advantage of this by moving slowly or kind of stretch and hold when we're trying to get more flexible. Maybe we're working on our shoulder, or maybe we're stretching the hamstrings, for example. So you want that slow stretch instead of a fast stretch. All that's going to do is it's going to trigger the muscle spindles to produce that stretch reflex. And also when you're stretching a muscle rapidly, it acts like a rubber band. It's more elastic, and the action potential stimulate more calcium release. You get a better overlap of actin and myosin. So all you're going to do is increase passive tension and increase active tension. So it's going to make it harder to stretch. And if you do this enough, all it's going to do is cause delayed onset muscle soreness and make you sore, and cause muscle damage, and actually reduce the amount of force that the muscle can produce. Not always a bad thing in terms of resistive training. So with the stretch reflex, the faster the stretch, the faster the action potentials come down those afferent motor neurons. And in fact, at the end of a windup is where we see the greatest EMG activity. So it's like taking a bow and arrow and putting a motor on it, a rocket on it maybe, and you're just going to let it go afterwards. So the windup when you're stretching rapidly becomes important, because you get that stretch reflex, which is going to increase the amount of force in the agonist muscles. So here's this stretch reflex working on the agonist muscle that's being stretched. If your physician, knocks on your patella tendon, that's going to cause a rapid stretch of the quadriceps. Those muscle spindles are going to communicate with interneurons. There should be an interneuron here. An interneuron, which is going to communicate then with the alpha motor neuron and send that information down to the quadriceps and make it contract higher. It also produces something called reciprocal inhibition. So if I'm lifting, maybe going to hold a weight, my friend says, this weighs 2 pounds, and I'm ready to grab it. He says, close your eyes. I said, okay. But it weighs actually 20 pounds. So that's going to stretch my biceps brachii and my brachialis, and we're going to get a stretch reflex and increase the force of those muscles. But it's going to relax the antagonist muscle pair. So that's done by reciprocal inhibition, where we have these afferent neurons. Yes, there's an interneuron. Very good. So the interneuron is going to inhibit action potentials from going down that alpha motor neuron by inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. That's going to reduce the frequency of action potentials, reduce recruitment of motor neurons and motor units, and that means that muscle is going to relax. You can take advantage of this, by the way, when you're doing stretching exercises. So if you want to, for example, stretch the hamstrings group, which a lot of people need to do because that old hamstrings, oh gosh, doesn't get stretched a lot during the course of the day. One of the best ways to do that is to contract and stretch the quadriceps first, and that's going to not only stimulate the stretch reflex, but it's going to stimulate reciprocal inhibition, which means that hamstrings now is more relaxed. There's a name for this. It's called proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. It's a big word, couple words. PNF, stretching, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. And that is a good way to stretch because you're taking advantage of some reflexes. Another way you can do it is to take advantage of stretching a muscle really, really hard and then relaxing it and then trying to stretch the same muscle. That's another way of taking advantage of PNF type strategies that takes advantage of the fact that when the muscle spindles are being stretched, they actually adapt over time, even if they're stretched rapidly. So that gamma motor neuron system is going to take over, and that actually makes it a little bit easier to stretch afterwards. So let's talk about some injuries really quickly. I'm not going to spend too much longer with that because I went slightly over yesterday. So maybe another couple of minutes, and I think we'll finish this and start with bone mechanics next week. This won't take long though. So with aging, what are some of the things that happen? Well, muscles start getting filled with connective tissue and fat. So that means if we look at a stress strain curve of a muscle, it actually gets stiffer because of the increased connective tissue and increased cross-linking of collagen. Increasing cross-linking of collagen happens in our tendons, ligaments. They get kind of stiffer as we get older. Our blood vessels get stiffer as we get older because there's more collagen, there's less laminin, and there's more cross-linking of the collagen, which increases the stiffness. You also get a fiber type shift. Maybe I'll highlight this in a different color, put it in red. Fiber type shift from slow twitch from fast twitch to slow twitch. You actually lose some fast twitch fibers due to apoptosis. There's also a shift from some of the fast twitch to slow twitch. So I'm afraid it is true. As you get older, you get slower. You get a little slower. Hopefully, if you keep exercising, keep working out, you can reduce some of that. In fact, there's really good evidence in animal models that is the case, and we think it's also true with people as well. It's a little bit more difficult, especially in the upper body. You're going to have to do some resistor training, but we think you might be able to keep some of that speed. Here we go. As we get older, oh, I hate this font. Okay. I didn't get to shift the font of this particular slide, but as we get older, again, we get an increase in connective tissue. Oh, elasticity decreases. That's one of the problems. And that means when we stretch a muscle, it doesn't bounce back nearly as well. Reduced recoil. And guess what that means? You can't store as much energy, and therefore you can't return as much energy and turn it into kinetic energy. So it means there's reduced efficiency when you're running and walking. Decreased muscle cross-sectional area. We call this sarcopenia. We think today might be a combination of sedentary lifestyle and aging. It may not be just aging itself until someone gets maybe into their 80s. But there's no guarantee because underlying disease, heart disease, hypertension, metabolic disease like obesity and type 2 diabetes, they can all contribute to loss of muscle mass and strength. You get a decreased number of fibers through apoptosis, which is a type of programmed cell death. Shift from fast twitch to slow twitch fibers, and again, a loss of fast twitch fibers for the most part. Decreased cross-sectional area of the fibers. So fewer fibers, the fibers are smaller, force production is down, and velocity is down, so power's way down. If you increase both force and velocity, that means power is really impaired. And that's why power athletes have a really tough time after age 35 or 40 because that power is starting to decrease. They may not see, if they keep in shape, a lot of aging until probably age 50 and beyond. Peak tension also occurs at a greater length as we get older. So it means it's going to be difficult for us to be able to produce as much power. So power definitely becomes a problem. Okay, as we get older, what are some of the reasons we lose muscle mass? Um, it's it's kind of a multi um, kind of there's a number of mechanisms. It's got quite a few. There are quite a few things going on with aging that can cause atrophy. Some of it we think is underlying cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, sedentary lifestyle. Some of it may be true aging, and part of that has to do with satellite cells and what happens there. As we get older, every day, we sometimes get a little bit of muscle damage, and maybe not enough to cause soreness, but it means that satellite cells have to be activated. So over time, we find that they're activated more poorly if they don't activate as well in an older person. So why is that? Is it because the satellite cells are old? Have they lost too much in terms of their telomeres? Or is it because the environment's old? Well, this was a debate that raged for about 20 years. We think we have a consensus now, but like all science is sometimes never completely sure. But here's what we think is actually happening in a normal person who's getting older, especially if they've been exercising a bit, especially if they can keep physically active. The satellite cells we think potentially are there, even though there are fewer nuclei, but they're not being activated. So we think satellite cells are just quiescent. They're just kind of lazy, just sitting there. Can they be activated? Well, that's a really good question. So these are three potential mechanisms by which reduction of satellite cell activation can happen in skeletal muscle as people get older. Reduction in growth hormone and IGF-1, that definitely happens. So if we can preserve IGF-1, one of the things that we found over the last decade or so is that lifelong physical activity and exercise helps to preserve some of the IGF-1. Every bout of exercise gives you a big spike of growth hormone. Oh, I was looking at a product they were selling on TV. It's one of the problems or one of the issues with being at home and working from home. You kind of flip on the TV and see what's on. And there was an infomercial about something that was supposed to increase growth hormone. And they were bragging that, ooh, it'll double growth hormone levels. Well, you can get an increase in 5, 6 times, like 400 or 500% increase in the amount of growth hormone naturally by exercising. If you do resistor training, you get a bigger spike. The longer you exercise, the greater the release of growth hormone. So you can do it naturally way better than this product could give it to you, even if it was actually true. Because you never know if it's actually true. As you know, supplements cannot be regulated by the FDA for the most part. And so you don't know what the quality control, you don't know if it's doing anything, you don't know what the science is. So in the situation where we have trouble with the COVID virus, it's really is a lot of noise. We're trying to figure out which of these drugs works and which of them doesn't, because it's a desperate straits. Doctors, physicians are trying a lot of things. Looks like the HIV drug isn't working. Hydroxychloroquine. Okay. Despite what our fearless leader says, I don't know. I think what they have to do, and as a scientist, this is what I like, what I always suggest, is go after the mechanism. What's wrong? What's the problem? Well, the problem with this, the SARS-CoV-2, or the virus that causes COVID-19, its problem is it goes after angiotensin converting enzyme number 2, or ACE2. It actually hooks a ride. The virus hooks a ride in lung cells on ACE2. So what the heck is ACE2? Well, there are two types of angiotensin converting enzymes. ACE1 is the one that converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. You may remember this from physiology or biology. Angiotensin 2 regulates blood pressure, sometimes too much so, can raise blood pressure. That's why antihypertensive drugs go after ACE1 or go after binding of angiotensin 2 to its receptor. So they may be interesting ways to attack this disease. We'll see what happens, but that's a potential mechanism. So getting back to ACE1 and ACE2. So ACE1 we can think about as being the bad guy. ACE2 is the good guy. So what happens is the virus attacks ACE2. ACE2 produces a truncated or short angiotensin 2. And that short angiotensin, what that does is protect against angiotensin 2. It fights angiotensin 2. So when the virus attacks ACE2 in the lungs, it decreases its ability to produce this truncated angiotensin. It's 1,7. It's a small peptide. So that's where the problem is. And that's why people who have hypertension, who have high blood pressure, are at risk. It's also why people who have metabolic disease are at risk, because the pathway that involves angiotensin 2 is actually the one that contributes to obesity and hypertension, as well as type 2 diabetes. So it's going to be interesting. We don't have a lot of time, obviously, to be able to test these things clinically. I read, I think yesterday, they're testing like 200 different types of drugs. So anyway, back to this, the mechanism. How's it working? That's what's most important, because that's how you get the best drugs. It's not just trying this and that willy-nilly, because physicians are supposed to first do no harm, do no harm. So you want to make sure you get the mechanism. I know there have been a lot of things being tried, and hopefully, keep our fingers crossed, we can find a combination that will work, as well as develop a vaccine. I know there's a few groups that are having some good luck with that. Okay, so back to this. So what is the mechanism? Well, IGF-1 and growth hormones, definitely one of the mechanisms. So exercise can protect against this. Testosterone, androgens, as you know, estrogen in women decreases in the early 50s. With men, it decreases slowly over time, starting at about 40 years of age. So both of those can be important. Insulin, if you have insulin-related problems with type 2 diabetes, that's also going to interfere with activation of satellite cells. And then nitric oxide. Nitric oxide helps to activate satellite cells. That's been known for, gosh, about 20 years now. It was first discovered in the year 2000 by a group up in Canada. So maybe L-arginine, maybe tetrahydrobiopterin. That may be a mechanism. So we think that there are problems with nitric oxide synthase, your androgens, growth hormone, insulin, and it's the environment. If you can make the environment young again, the satellite cells wake up. It's like Rip Van Winkle. They'll wake up and do their job. There have been some really interesting, clever animal studies that have been done doing just exactly that. Okay. So can lifelong exercise, avoiding being a couch potato? I got to pay attention to this right now. Does it make a difference? So here's a study that was done with rats. There was a collaboration with the University of Florida with this. These are cross sections of, and they're all on the same scale. These are rats. These are young rats. So they have these fairly big fibers. These are in cross section. And here you can see the nuclei, really nice looking nuclei, really clean, very thin extracellular matrix in the endomysium. Well, they look good. Big muscle fibers. Those are slow twitch, these darker ones, by the way. These are fast twitch fibers. Here's an old couch potato. This is a rat that's a little over 2 years old. It's been hanging around, just doing nothing, munching out. Boy, things look kind of bad. This is the same scale. The muscle fibers are real small. You got one that looks like a boomerang. Some of these are fat cells. Some of them are fibroblasts that you see here. Some of them are inflammatory cells. So, oh boy, it's really scary looking. When we combine, this is a diet and exercise group where they had about a 10% caloric restriction, and they were able to exercise. They had a running wheel. What we see is partial protection against the atrophy that we see with aging. So we've seen this with farmers kind of more anecdotally. There's some data that people who are active throughout their lifespan, either they work on a wharf or they farm, they're able to keep their muscle mass and strength up to age 70 and beyond. So that's really exciting. And this is a follow-up on that particular study. We see this is a diet group, and this is a diet and exercise group. We see protection of muscle cross-sectional area. And look how nice they look. You don't have this connective tissue and fat. Look how clean that is. So that's a big difference. So what's going on there? This one looks kind of scary. So I think this is going to be our last slide of the day because I'm probably running over again, as usual. So don't want to take up too much more time, but what's going on here? Well, in the dystrophin glycoprotein complex, these are 3 proteins that are hooked up together. With muscular dystrophy, all 3 of these proteins are gone. With aging, what happens? Well, this is the young rat, cold control rat. This is the old rat. And it looks like someone smeared this thing up. Did something happen here? No, this is real. What happens is you start losing dystrophin, but it's not even. It's not all the way around the cell. Some cells are losing part of it. Some are losing a lot. Some are losing dystrophin on one side, which is really making things gnarly because centrophin, which is a protein that's attached to it, and nNOS, look at nNOS. It's mostly gone from the cell membrane. When it's not there, it can't activate satellite cells. It can't protect the muscle. It's not going to be helpful in terms of increasing protein synthesis and repairing that muscle. But what happens when we add in, this is the last group over here. This is a combination of a little bit of diet. It's only 10%. It's like basically cutting out about 200 calories a day. And then exercising, getting in about 200, 300 calories. That's like walking or running 2 or 3 miles. That's all it really took. In fact, I think these rats were running on the running wheel about 2 or 3 miles a day. That's about what they put in, usually about 2. They were kind of lazy, about 2 miles a day. But when putting in 2 miles a day, look what happens. Dystrophin is largely still there on the cell membrane. So is centrophin, which binds to both of these proteins, keeps things in place. And then nNOS looks pretty good. So when we went in and did some analysis, that's exactly what we found. So by exercising over the lifespan, what we've been able to see with rats, and we've also tested this with Weddell seals and shrews. Seals are from Antarctica, the shrews are from Canada. Regardless of how you look at it, you don't see a lot of sarcopenia in these animals. You don't see a lot of muscle wasting. There's some, but it's really attenuated. So in this exercise that the rats did was not high intensity. It's not even as high as most people would use when they do cardio. So it didn't even take exercise that, it's like walking. That intensity was enough to protect the muscle mass. And these were fast twitch muscles. These were plantaris muscles, fast twitch muscles. So indeed, you can protect yourself. So we're going to stop right here, finish up, talk about the effects of aging and this protective effect of exercise. We'll talk about delayed onset muscle soreness and start our section on bone mechanics as we get now into connective tissue mechanics to finish out the semester. So we'll have bones, tendons, ligaments, cartilage. So that's what to look forward to in our last 4 to 5 chapters of the book. So we're indeed getting close to the end. Okay, thanks for listening. Thanks for hanging in there. Have a great day. Stay safe. Stay healthy, everyone. And we will see you in terms of a lecture next week, but we'll see you real time On Friday, we'll have the pop quiz at 2 o'clock. 4 o'clock on Friday, we'll have our open session. I'm working out what's going to go on again with the test. It looks like we're going to have it next Wednesday again. We're going to try to hold it about 6 p.m. We'll open it up for a couple of hours. It looks like at this point it is going to be almost fully, if not completely, short answer, or probably free response is the best way to put it. It will technically be open book, but you'll want to study for this because you'll be limited in the amount of time. If you have to look through all of your notes while you're writing stuff down, it's going to take you a long time. So come prepared. If you need to look at some notes during the exam, you certainly can do that. But obviously, you'll have to do it as individual work. Okay, have a great one. We will be seeing you really, really soon.